Infinitives, what are they? Well, an infinitive is a verbal. And if you remember, we distinguish between verbs and verbals. Verbs have subjects. Verbals never take a subject. Now, verbals are a hybrid, a verb plus an adjective. So a verbal adjective is what we call a participle, and a verb plus a noun. So a verbal noun is a gerund. So when we have a word that has the characteristics of both a verb and an adjective, we call that a participle. When we have a word that has the characteristics of both a verb and a noun, it is a gerund. Well, an infinitive fits in this category of verbal. It is always identified because it is to plus a verb. To run, to hit, to study. And the interesting thing about infinitives is that they can play, or they can perform all three of the major functions that we've discussed already. They can be adverbial, adjectival, or substantival, or that means they can perform any of the noun functions. So infinitives are very easy to find because it's always going to be to plus some verb, to hit, to run, to study. But they're the most difficult to analyze in terms of their function because they can be all three of these things. If you have a participle, you know it's going to be adjectival. And if you have a gerund, you know it's going to be substantival. But infinitives can be all three of these things. So let's look first at an adverbial infinitive. Here we have the account of Rehoboam. And when he saw that he was in trouble, he hurried. So here's the subject, Rehoboam. Verb, hurried. Why did he hurry? Well, he hurried to flee. So that means this infinitive, to flee, notice how easy that is to pick out. It's to plus a verb. By the way, if it's to plus a noun, if this was to the dog, or to the store, or to the man, that would be a prepositional phrase. But infinitives are always to plus a verb, to flee. So if you ask yourself the questions, and remember the adverbial questions, how, when, where, and why, this clearly is answering the why question. He hurried. Why? To flee. And by the way, you can see there's another infinitive right here, to mount. To mount. Now let's move on then and look at an adjectival infinitive. Now again, this is going to be more difficult, but notice this sentence, for we really are in danger of being charged with rioting today, since there is no cause that we can give to justify this commotion. So this is Paul in the city of Ephesus. And you'll remember the great riot, commotion that started when Paul preached the gospel there. But notice the infinitive here, to justify. Well, to justify is telling us more about this word right here. In fact, it's answering the what kind question. What kind of cause are we talking about here? Well, you'll remember the ruler of the city came out and said, and warned them that they were going to be in trouble because this was a riot that was unwarranted. There was no good cause for it. So what he's saying here is that this cause here is not sufficient to justify this commotion. What kind of cause? A cause to justify this commotion. You might call it a to justify this commotion cause, in which case you can see that it's an adjective modifying this noun cause. Now that's a little bit more difficult to see, but all the same, this is an infinitive phrase here, modifying the noun cause, and therefore it's going to be adjectival. Now when we look at another adverbial one, this one is quite simple, as when someone goes into the forest with his neighbor to cut wood. And you can see here that this is answering the why question. Why would he go out into the forest? To cut wood. The infinitive is to cut. The entire infinitive phrase is to cut wood. And again, why would somebody swing his axe? Well, the reason the hand swings the axe is to cut. That's the infinitive. The whole infinitive phrase here, of course, is to cut down a tree. To cut down a tree. But this infinitive is answering the why question. By the way, whenever you have an adverbial infinitive, it'll almost always be answering the why question, giving a reason, the cause for something. Now here's a substantival infinitive. From that time Jesus began to preach, saying. Now if you ask yourself, Jesus began what? while he began to preach. So that tells us that this infinitive here is the direct object of the verb began. Remember, that's how we find direct objects. We ask ourselves, what? So you take the subject plus the verb. Jesus began what? Well, he began to preach. Sometimes these are called complementary infinitives, which is useful because this is the complement of this verb here, began. Just like any object is the complement of the verb, or the verbal that it's the complement of. So this infinitive is called a complementary infinitive because it is the object of the verb began. Now here's another sentence. How are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? How are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? Obviously from Romans 10. And all these infinitives are predicate nominatives. Now that might not be immediately clear to you because these are questions. But remember, whenever you have an interrogative sentence like this, just switch it into a declarative sentence. So instead of saying, how are they to believe in him, say, they are to believe in him. They are to hear. And they are to preach. And now you can see that these infinitives are the predicate nominative of the linking verb are. They're not objects. Notice this is a linking verb. It's a form of the verb to be. And therefore, these are going to be predicate nominatives. But a predicate nominative is still a noun function. And therefore, all these infinitives are substantival infinitives. They're performing the function of a noun.